Welcome back to third part of our tutorial on how to build the income statement from scratch in valQ for Microsoft Power BI. To give a recap, we have imported the data from our backend Azure Analysis Services and have successfully created a blank valQ model. In this video, we'll be configuring the valQ model as per the accounts shown in the design here. So let's get started with the configuration of the nodes. We'll be configuring the child nodes first, followed by the parent nodes. So let me quickly expand the tree and start configuring the first child of gross sales. As the edit node pops up, it will be by default in General tab. So you have a unique ID assigned to your nodes created here by default. Moving on to the configuration tab, in the calculation method option, we select the mode by which the node goods would be set to. Here we'll be setting it to the data source, and in the field source key, we'll be mapping the data goods to the respective node. Then comes our time aggregation field. We have various options here like sum, average, etc. Out of which we'll be choosing sum of periods option. Desired trend would be set to increase for the overall increase in my net sales. I'll be leaving the value range blank for all the nodes throughout this tutorial. So as I navigate to my display tab, I'll be choosing the show button by default, although we have two other options called as derived and hidden. With respect to scale, again we have various options as shown here. But for this node, we would go for user selected. Also, you could choose how many decimal places you would want to opt for. For now, I'll just add my prefix to $. I will leave my suffix field empty. And as you can see, the details on click would be toggled on by default. So as I navigate to my simulation tab, I would enable the simulation for my node goods in order to understand its effect on gross sales, net sales, and furthermore my net profit. As you can see, I also have 4 different methods in which I can simulate the node. I would be going for my percentage change method in order to understand how my forecast will be changing with respect to its budget across the future periods. Throughout this tutorial, I wouldn't be filling up the details in business definition section here. So this is the global conditional formatting that has been applied to my node here. However, you may go ahead and customize on node basis too in order to understand the performance of that KPI. So once the configuration is done, you would be able to see that the node would now be activated in your canvas as shown here. We shall now go ahead and start configuring the rest of the child nodes of gross sales, services and others. Starting with services, I'll fetch services data from my data source. I'll keep the desired trend as increase. I'll just add my prefix here. And I'll go for the default simulation setting. Similarly, for my 11th node, others, I'll fetch the data from my data source. I'll set the desired trend as increase. Add my prefix $. And go for my default simulation method. Once I'm done with the child nodes here, I'll go ahead and configure my gross sales. The calculation method would be sum children. Desired trend would be increase. I'll add my prefix here and go for the default simulation method change percentage. So once done, I would be able to see that the nodes would now be activated in my canvas. Moving on, I'll start configuring the child nodes of discounts and commissions. I'll fetch my data sales discount from my data source. Set the desired trend as decrease in order to have increase in my net sales. Add my prefix here. and go for by default simulation method. Same setting would now be applied to my second child node of discounts and commissions, which is sales commissions. Add my prefix here and go for my default simulation method. I will now go ahead and configure my discounts and commissions node. Calculation method would be set to sum children. Desired trend as decrease. Add my prefix as dollar and go for my default simulation method. As I'm done with the child nodes of net sales, I'll go ahead and configure my net sales here. My calculation method would be subtract children, gross sales minus discounts and commissions. Desired trend would be increase for my overall increase in my net profit. Add my prefix here and go for my default simulation method. There you go. You will now be able to see that net sales as well as its child nodes would now be activated in Canvas. We'll now go ahead and configure the child nodes of cost of sales. To begin with, we'll first fetch the data material from the data source. Set the desired trend as decrease. Add the prefix $, and go for the default simulation method change percentage. We'll follow the same setting for labor as well as others. We'll fetch the data labor from the data source. Add my prefix and go for the default simulation method. Similarly, fetch data others from the data source. Set the desired trend as decrease. Add the prefix $, and go for the default simulation method change percentage. Once done, we'll go ahead and configure the parent node cost of sales. Calculation method would be sum children. Desired trend would be decrease. Add prefix $, and go for the default simulation method. You will now be able to see the activated nodes in Canvas. I'll now go ahead and start configuring the child nodes of operating expenses. Starting with bank charges, I'll fetch the data from my data source. I'll set the desired trend as decrease for my overall increase in my net profit. Add my prefix here and go for the default simulation method. Similarly, for the consultant fees, fetch the data from my data source. Set the desired trend as decrease. Add my prefix and go for my default simulation setting, which is change percentage. Office supplies, fetching my data from my data source, setting the desired trend as decrease, adding my prefix, and going for my default simulation method. Last but not the least, business insurance, fetching my data, setting the desired trend to decrease, adding my prefix $, and going for the default simulation setting. As I'm done now with the child nodes, I'll go ahead and configure the parent node. So general and administrative would be the sum of all the child nodes. Hence the calculation method would be set to sum children. Add my prefix and go for the default simulation setting. As we are done with general and administrative, which is the first child node of operating expenses, we'll now go ahead and start configuring the second node of operating expenses, which is advertising and promotions. Starting with advertising, fetching the data advertising from my data source, setting the desired trend to decrease, adding my prefix $, and going for my default simulation setting. Similarly, the node promotion, fetching the data promotion from my data source, setting the desired trend to decrease, and adding my prefix $, going for my default simulation setting. I'll now go ahead and configure its parent node, where the calculation method would be sum children, setting the desired trend to decrease, and going for the default simulation method. I will now go ahead and configure the third child node of operating expenses, which is equipment and systems, fetching the data from data source, setting the desired trend to decrease, adding my prefix $, and going for the default simulation setting. I'll now go ahead and start configuring the child nodes of other miscellaneous. Fetching the data salaries from my data source, adding my prefix here, and going for the default simulation method. Similarly, benefits, fetching the data from data source, setting the desired trend to decrease, adding my prefix here, and going for my default simulation setting. Recruitment, fetching the data from data source, setting the desired trend to decrease, adding my prefix here, which is $, and going for the default simulation setting. Last but not the least, node insurance, fetching the data from my data source, setting the desired trend, adding my prefix here, and going for the default simulation setting. Once done, I'll now go ahead and configure its parent node, other miscellaneous, set the calculation method as sum children, set the desired trend as decrease, add my prefix, and go for my default simulation method. I'll now start configuring the child nodes of rent and facilities, fetch the data power from my data source, set the desired trend as decrease, add my prefix, and go for the default simulation method. Fetch the data telephone from my data source, set the desired trend as decrease, add my prefix $, and go for the default simulation setting. Fetch the data rent from my data source, set the desired trend as decrease, add my prefix here, and go for the default simulation setting. Last but not the least, the last child node of rent and facilities, which is repair and maintenance, will also follow the same default setting. Adding my prefix here and going for the default simulation method, which is change percentage. Once done, I'll now go ahead and configure its parent node, rent and facilities, whose calculation method would be sum children, where the rest of the settings again would be similar to what we have done for the children. We'll now go ahead and configure the last child node of operating expenses, fetching the data depreciation from my data source, setting the desired trend to decrease, adding the prefix $, and going for the default simulation method. So once done, we will be able to see in Canvas that the nodes that we have configured would now be activated. We'll now go ahead and configure its parent node, which is the operating expenses. The calculation method would be sum children, desired trend would be set to decrease, add the prefix $, and go for the default simulation method. We shall now go ahead and start configuring our fifth node, which is our gross profit. The calculation method would be a formula. The formula would be net sales minus cost of sales into 100 divided by net sales. The time aggregation that I would set would be average. Where the weighted average node would be that of net sales. I would be showing this as a derived node, wherein I'll set the scale to none. I would only be interested in how gross profit would be for my simulations performed on the other nodes. I will also disable the simulation. Similarly, I'll go ahead and configure my sixth node, which is the operating profit. I'll go for the formula net sales minus cost of sales minus operating expenses into 100 divided by net sales. My time aggregation would be average, where the weighted average node would be net sales. My desired trend would be set to increase. I'll go set it to a derived node display. I'll set the scale to none. I'll add decimal places to 1. And I'll add my suffix here. I'll disable the simulation for this node as well and set the default simulation method, which is the change percentage. So you will be able to see that since these two nodes are derived nodes, they would be represented in dotted lines in Canvas. We'll now go ahead and configure our 25th node, which is the child node of our interest and taxes. I'll set the calculation method as manual, wherein I'll enter both primary and comparison value as 25, considering that it would be a corporate tax. Time aggregation would be average, where the weighted average node would be operating profit. Desired trend would be decrease. I'll set it as a derived node display, where the scale is set to none, and I'll add my suffix here. I will disable the details on click option 2 and the simulation as well. I will now go ahead and start configuring my 23rd node, which is interest expenses. I'll fetch the data from my data source. I'll set the desired trend as increase. Add my prefix here. I will now go ahead and configure my 24th node, which is income taxes. Calculation method would be a formula, which would be net sales minus cost of sales minus operating expenses minus interest expenses whole into estimated tax rate divided by 100. I'll set the desired trend as decrease for the overall increase in my net profit. Add my prefix here to dollar. Disable my simulation. And also disable the conditional formatting feature for that node alone. Now that we are done with the child nodes of interest and taxes, I'll now go ahead and configure the parent node, interest and taxes. I'll set the calculation method as formula, which would be interest expenses plus income taxes. Set the desired trend as increase. Set my prefix. And go for my default simulation method. Now that we are done with the child nodes, we'll now go ahead and configure the parent node, which is my net profit. My calculation method would be formula, which would be net sales minus cost of sales minus operating expenses minus interest expenses minus income taxes. Time aggregation would be sum of periods and my desired trend would be increase. I'll add my prefix here and disable the simulation aspect here. We can now go ahead and simulate few of the accounts in order to see how my net profit would be affected. Thus, through this tutorial, we learned how to build an income statement from scratch using valQ for Microsoft Power BI. Thanks for watching and keep watching the space for more.